So we're going to talk about the return, and I guess from what we hear, this is usually money, and this is people's biggest hurdle. How do I do this? And it's kind of funny, all of us have done it, we're on the other side, it's all hindsight, ha ha ha, it's so easy, blah, blah, blah. But it's funny, not even just in America, but so much to break out of your job and your career is so hard, to get off that mainstream that we're all on and we're all told to do and going down this path of life that we're supposed to be doing. And it's so different to kind of veer off and do something different. So number one, we're excited that you're all here and thinking about it because obviously our lives didn't implode and we're all still here living, hopefully not homeless. So I also want to just find out, because we talk about career breaks, we talk about sabbaticals. I'm curious, for those of you that are still working full-time, how many of you, the company you work for, will give you a sabbatical? One. So unfortunately, there are companies, I know a few, Morningstar, every few years they give sabbaticals, and there are Cargill, a few companies that do it. Unfortunately, it's not the mainstream yet. Just another thing we're hoping to get more in the forefront for it to be normal and companies start doing it. I know some startups and some tech companies do things like that. I actually used to work in television, and I asked my boss in 2004 when I was thinking of some sort of travel, because like some of you that I talked to, I was depressed when I'd come back from trips. I wanted to go again. I didn't want to come back. Thank you. Now we're not in the dark here. And I asked my boss, do you think I could take a sabbatical? Will ABC? And I think she laughed and said, no, that's impossible. And I said, okay. And I slunk back to my cubicle. But I kind of just, that was it. Oh, well, she said, no, there's no other choice for me, because that was seeming, if they said no, there's no other way to just quit. I can't just quit. I mean, that's crazy. And then 2 years later, I just quit. And I didn't know it was going to happen. Kind of like some of you, it's formulating your thinking until you finally do reach that tipping point when you realize, I can do this. People have done this. I've met people now that have done this. So when I came back, for me, I think I'm the only one actually on the panel who was full-time. I had a 401k. I was a responsible adult. And now I'm a freelancer. Like many people today, also no 401k. Well, I still have it. But I don't contribute to it. So we're going to kind of just talk about a little bit what we did before and what we do now after we've taken this career break. So I just want to kind of go down the panel. We have Katie and Nelson and Paul here. And we're just going to talk a little bit about, first kind of talking about, did you definitely know what you wanted to do when you came back, and did that change? I'll start with Katie. Oh, right here.
Does this one work? Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yep.
So before I left on my career break, I was working in alumni relations and development at a law school in Chicago. I knew I did not want to go back to that job. I was very unhappy in that particular job before I left. I hoped to transition into a new career when I came back, either something more travel related or working for more of an internationally focused nonprofit rather than a university setting. I applied for a variety of jobs when I came back in those areas, as well as back in my old field. And as it so happened, I ended up getting a job almost identical to my previous job, but at a different law school. But it ended up, I've been back for almost 2 years now, and much, much, much happier in what I'm doing than what I was before. I have an amazing boss, and I like the school that I'm working for much better, and the whole situation is much better than what I left. And I still kind of have like a freelance career on the side now, doing some travel writing on the side. So I'm sort of marrying the two together.
Before I took my career break, I was essentially a project manager, a manager of engineering for a mobile advertising network. And since coming back, I essentially do the exact same thing. I had the opportunity, just kind of being in an emerging field where, the jobs, I don't want to say were plentiful, but they were there, and I saw a lot of other people kind of transitioning to other positions. You realize that there are jobs, when you get back. And as long as you have a skill set that you believe in and you think you're hireable and you think you're somebody, who can go into an interview and engage somebody, that there's very little risk, there's very little difference between taking half a year off to get a new job versus going from one job to the next. So the risk is almost mitigated when you think of it that way.
I actually work at the same company as I did prior to my sabbatical.
Did you take a sabbatical?
It was circumstantial. So I work for Capgemini. It's an IT consulting firm. And during the economic crisis, they were offering leaves of absence to our consultants because we had all these people who were salaried and being paid, but they weren't staffed on projects. I wasn't a consultant, I was a recruiter, but it's always easier to do something when somebody else has done it prior to you, right? So it was harder for them to say no, and I'd been there for about 5 years at that point. And I was on the verge of quitting anyway, so I didn't really care if they said yes or no. So I figured it was worth a shot. But I did stress to them, and this is a piece of advice that I would give to anybody who's contemplating this. I stressed to them that I wanted to return. And so about 2 months into the break, I took 4 months off, 3 of which I traveled. 2 months in, they emailed me and they said they had a position for me, which I ended up taking. So I'm still at the same company.
For me, really quick, I said I worked in television. I was a TV producer. I had a great job. I worked at ABC for 10 years. And it was great. I interviewed chefs. I was out doing restaurant stories and some travel stories. But I also was bored with it. And I had done it for a long time, and I wasn't being challenged anymore. And I quit to travel. But I wasn't sure if that's what I would do when I got back. I really just left it open. And for me, actually, the longer I traveled, the more open I became and the less worried I became, because I was using all these crazy skills all around the world. I was doing PR in Spain. I was writing. I was doing photography. I started to do consulting, some video consulting. And I realized how scrappy I could be, and also was able to kind of like hone in. I've been telling some of you to think about all your skills, not just your degree or just your job, but even we talk about teaching English. Oh, you speak English natively? That's amazing. That's great. Because you can but not even that, just like, if I worked in media, so I was lucky. I already did photography, I did writing, but I knew PR because I was always on the other side of it, and kind of just realizing all of the things, and then becoming a travel expert and realizing that you can help other people with this and those kind of skills. So when I came back, already being in media, I didn't really stay in TV. Now I just do freelance, more print writing and photography, and just sort of parlayed it into that, although I still can freelance in TV. So I kind of organically let it breathe a little, and I even told myself, well, I'm going to keep trying this freelance thing until I turn 40. Well, that was 2 years ago. And it's working, and I'm making less money than I used to make, but I also have learned all these ways to save money by continuing to host on Airbnb, or I don't have a cell phone plan, or all these different ways, to me, are making money, because I see it differently now. Those ways, I'm making money because I'm saving money, so I kind of balance out each month. So there's so many different things. It depends on if you want to go back into your same career, or if you want to try something new, go back to school, so many different things. Some people talk about, so when you come back, what about if you are interviewing for a full-time job? I don't think I personally actually ever used my resume again, but if you are, so people say, well, what do you put on there? I do have a place on there, because for me, it was working. I'll call it freelance. So when I left, I started writing. So it's traveling, it's writing, it's being international relations, whatever you want to call it. You've done and learned a lot of independence. Of course, you had to use your resume. So why don't you tell us what you put on your resume?
Sure. So a lot of resumes tend to be organized chronologically, and if you do that, the very first thing on your resume is going to be a gap, because you've been gone for a year, and people most likely are not going to look at that always super favorably. So what I did was I organized my resume functionally. And I had a couple different versions based on the different kinds of jobs I was applying for, if it was a travel job or a pure nonprofit job or a job back in my old field. And I started with a section called Relevant Experience, and started that with everything from the job that I had left. And so the very first thing that people saw on my resume were the accomplishments that I had in the 4.5 years that I was at my prior job. So that's what really, would hopefully catch their eye, and, had all the good keywords and stuff for the resume scanners to read. And then further on, I had a section for other experience. And this didn't just have my travel experience, but I had a previous career as a lawyer, and so I also had a little bit on that too. But I basically had a section called, I think it was like International Travel and Education Experience. And I listed off, the time that I was gone, the countries I visited, the fact that I taught English and I volunteered and I studied Russian language, and I launched a travel blog and I wrote some travel articles for a bunch of websites. And so I completely owned it. And then in my cover letter, same thing. I, went on, this is what I did before. I left that job in 2011, spent this time traveling. I think, that experience makes me even more qualified for this position for X, Y, and Z reasons, and tailor that to whatever job I was applying for. So I put it front and center, and in every case, I tried to kind of mold it to, why it made me a better candidate for the job that I was applying for.
Nelson, did you put it on your resume?
I didn't specifically call attention to it. I just let it be there. So when I applied for jobs and people were like, well, you haven't been in work for a year. And I wanted them specifically to ask about it because I knew that it was going to make for a really great story. And every single person that I spoke to in interviews, it was immediately like, oh my goodness, tell me a story. And then you'd quickly go off into these weird stories about, your travels. And then eventually they're like, oh, well, let's get back to the job. That's awesome. So it really seemed to kind of work out in my favor, and people really kind of appreciated it, and they very much understood.
Because I think we're in kind of parlaying into that when we talk about the interview itself. When it came up, because you did several interviews too, did you find positive, negative reactions? You were positive, Nelson, pretty much.
I would say my reaction was mixed. I remember I was in the middle of one phone interview, and the guy I was talking to was like, "So let me get this straight. You just went and you quit a perfectly good, well-paying job to just travel and like not have an income for a year." And it was kind of like, yeah. And then it was like this silence. He was like, "That's pretty awesome." And I was just like, whew, okay, like big sigh of relief. But I think for the most part, particularly the travel jobs that I was applying for, I had an offer for a job in the travel industry. I wouldn't have even been looked at for that job if I hadn't had all that travel experience on my resume. Same thing for another job that I ended up getting an offer for that I turned down. That was more like an internationally focused organization. Probably would not have even gotten in the door. The jobs that I interviewed for back in my old field, it did come up. I wouldn't say negatively, but I did get questions like, so is this out of your system? Are you going to leave again? Are you sure you're ready to come back? And I had answers prepared for all of that. At the time I was honestly completely exhausted, and I was really ready to come back. I was really ready to get back into a routine and to have a steady paycheck again. And I told them that, and it was obviously convincing enough because I got hired again. So, I wouldn't say it was a negative, but there were definitely questions, but I was able to parlay those, overcome those concerns. And it was good points of conversation. I had one guy tell me, oh, wow, my son did that a couple of years ago. And so it did make for, more interesting interviews.
What about on the flip side too, Paul, you were talking about earlier, not just is it positive or negative, their thought of it, but what about if it's negative? Is that the kind of place that you might want to work for?
Right. I think that if you are looking for a new job, then you want an employer who recognizes how significant it is to travel and to actually execute this dream that most people don't have the courage to see through. I wouldn't want to work for somebody who would look at this on my resume and say, you shouldn't have done that. That pregnant pause that she was experiencing, I thought that was actually going to be the opposite reaction, like you did.
That's what I
And
thought, too.
immediately in my head, I said to myself, I wouldn't have wanted to accept that job then, if that were the case. So,
It's hard for me to say because I haven't gone on any interviews per se, and I'm in a creative field. But I will say I think it's a total amazing boon to my resume, and I think it's great because most people I talk to are usually like, wow, that's so great. It took courage, independence, like all these things. I've never heard a negative thing. I mean, when I first left to travel, there were a few people that were a little bit more of those people that are like, you're so lucky. How did you get to do that? As if they don't have the power to do the same thing. I'm like, I made a choice. But I think, what do you guys think the key takeaway is for a career break? Like what that does add to your experience?
For me, and I think this goes for a lot of kind of non-traditional, time spent during your career, it teaches you how to deal with, the crap that goes on at work, excuse my French, is nothing compared to like when you're on a bus in Cambodia at 4 a.m. and then there's a bus strike and you're not going to make your flight. And I've told people that I say, look, it teaches you how to keep a cool head. It teaches you how to, deal with adversity. Unless you're somebody who flew somewhere and stayed in a resort for 8 months, but I don't think anybody who would come to this event is that type of person. So I always spin it as I've been through a lot worse than what I'm going to deal with, if the PowerPoint crashes in the middle of a presentation. And it teaches you kind of, roll with the punches and learn from them and then kind of move on.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, for me, it gave me a new perspective on things. Even being back, 2 years now, there's still things that I sort of realize that I'm still kind of learning from my trip and, how I look at things differently and, realizing that, there's a lot of people out there that have things a lot worse. And, if you're on Twitter and you see, like the hashtag first world problems, like, there's a lot of things that we stress out about every single day that really aren't that big of a deal. And one thing, I've spent some time volunteering in Armenia, and it basically, like, my volunteer job was with the de facto National Tourism Board of Armenia. And so I basically was, going into their office 9 to 5 every day. And so that kind of gave me this taste of, going back. And I realized, like, there were the same office politics there. There was the same, it's kind of like, it's the same everywhere. It's whatever, you're dealing with in your office environment and stuff, like, people go through that everywhere. So it gave me a new appreciation and experience and the soft skills that I think you can really plug to employers. Like you were out there, negotiating in another language, communication skills, problem solving, you're lost and you can't figure out, how to get to the train station. You're thinking on your feet. And I think all of those things are things that you can emphasize to employers, that are skills that you developed while you're on the road.
Yeah, and I think confidence. I mean, probably all of you were just so confident in your interviews because you were negotiating other crazy things other places. So,
and it also, kind of reminds you and it teaches you that, we work to live, we shouldn't live to work. And as Americans, you kind of have that mentality of like people get so, they identify themselves by their job and they're afraid to be without that. And that's kind of the coat that, they can't be without. And then once you go a while just traveling, once you go a while without a paycheck, once you go a while not introducing yourself as, hey, I'm a project manager at XYZ company, you're just like, I'm me. And I'm doing what I want for a while. In my mind, at least, teaches you not to bring work home. If I had a bad day at work after my trip, it's like, okay, well, whatever. And I'd go home and I'd enjoy the rest of my evening, whereas before, you'd take that stress home with you. You're not sleeping well. You're thinking about it. All you're thinking about is your coworkers and what's going on the next day. And, you go on vacation and all you can think about is what's going to happen when you get back. It teaches you to kind of really appreciate, that we are more than just our job titles.
yeah, when I returned, it made me less worried because now I knew that I could figure out how to make money through a few freelance jobs, or I got an application, an application to work at Starbucks. Maybe I'll just work there somewhere like that because I served coffee in Australia. I know how now. And I think before when I was working in TV with I would be like so embarrassed if my coworkers saw me at Starbucks, like, oh, she must have, wow, took a downturn, but now I didn't care. Now it was like fun and easy and carefree. While I built up my freelance career, I could do that and make money to break even because it totally changed my mentality on even making money, that I just needed enough to pay my rent and figure out a few things, keep my bills low, and I wasn't as stressed out to get the next big job and career, and I'm still not. And I'm still kind of just sort of breaking even and kind of really happy. So I want to open it up to questions. I want to give you guys some time to ask job questions. So right here.
So what was the transition like when you were coming back? Like a month or so before you came back, were you sending out resumes? Were you even on that page? Or did you say, I'm going to take the whole time and then just enjoy it and then give myself a buffer when you come back?
So the whole coming back and finding a job again thing was probably my biggest fear when I left, and it was something that I probably worried about too much the entire time I was gone. I started sending out resumes again about 2 months before I came back. I actually did 2 phone interviews while I was on the road via Skype. I came back end of September 2012. I had my first job offer within 3 weeks. That was with a travel company. I ended up turning that down. And I started work January 22nd, 2013. So it was about October, November, December. I accepted that job on New Year's Day. So about 3 months. I had 5 job offers in that 3 months. So.
And I kind of use a lot of the downtime you get when you travel, like on buses and trains and in airport, gates, terminals, to just kind of network. So at least, 2 days a week, I would just draft up a bunch of emails to people I used to work with or people I wanted to keep in contact with. And then I kind of ramped it up about a month and a half, 2 months before I got back. And literally, I had an interview the day after I got back. They were just like, as soon as you get back, just please come in. We want to interview you. And I ended up accepting an offer about 6 weeks after I'd gotten back.
Even though I went back to the same company, I did allow myself about 5 or 6 weeks once I was back in the States to network, and I hired a career counselor just in case if I wanted to change careers or if I, found something more lucrative or more attractive than what I was going to be doing at the same company.
So obviously there's not one answer, and I think it's interesting though because it kind of goes down the line, and then I'm still transitioning 5 years later and trying to figure out what I want to do, because I really gave myself space, and I think it's interesting because you were saying maybe it kind of took away a little. How do you feel, Nelson? Because you're like, the day I got back, like you didn't allow, and you were already like doing it on the road. Do you think that was good, bad, interfered with some of the experience?
I think the networking part was good because, like I said, you have a lot of downtime, and by the end of my trip, I was just like, who can I email? What can I do to kill this, train ride? So that was good, but yeah, it was definitely like a very quick.
Isn't it supposed to be about the train ride, about the journey?
After the 40th train, it's no longer. So I mean, but it was very quick. I was ready to come home and like relax, and it was just like day 2. So I mean, maybe that was like a little ill-advised, but it did help me, kind of just get back on my feet nice and quick.
I would just add, one of the things I think was nice, like when I was doing my budget and my savings, like I had allowed myself enough of a financial cushion, so I felt comfortable turning down a couple job offers when I came back. And the first couple offers I got, I just, I was like, I would not be happy doing this. And so I was grateful that I had given myself that cushion, that I didn't feel like I had to take the very first job that came along, because I think that can be, you don't, you want to come back and you want to take a job that you think you're going to be happy in. And so I had the luxury, to do that and to look around. I mean, I could have been employed within, a month of coming back, and I was able to wait, so.
Great. Questions?
For the 3 folks at the table, I'm curious, so now it sounds like you have pretty traditional jobs again, where you probably had 2-3 weeks vacation here. You obviously traveled through it's important to you. How do you feel now, though, that you're once again restricted?
So how do you feel now, back in your cubicle,
So-
chained to a desk?
So in the past calendar year, I have been to Nepal, Boston, Atlanta, California, DC, Minnesota, Toronto, Bulgaria, and now New York. So I definitely, it hasn't restricted me, and I'm going to Africa for 2 weeks over Thanksgiving. I'm lucky. I work for a university, so I get 3 weeks vacation, and we're closed between Christmas and New Year's, so I have that as an extra week off. My boss is awesome. She knew, from the day she hired me, I actually had to have this conversation with her because I had won a photography truck in Nepal right before I was accepting this job, and the truck was going to be the next fall, and it was 3 weeks, so it was basically going to be all of my vacation time. And some employers, are kind of like, they want you to spread it out and don't want you to go all at one chunk. And so when I called her to accept the job, I was like, by the way, I kind of won this trip, and it's kind of next October for 3 weeks, and I just kind of want to know right now, like, would that be okay? And she just started laughing, and she's like, it's your vacation time, you can do with it what you want. And I sort of knew right then that, I had made the right decision, and that it would be okay. And, she's great with it, and I just, I take all of my vacation and plan very strategically, going over like Labor Day, so it's one less day that I have to take off, and going over Thanksgiving, so it's 2 less days that I have to take off, so.
It's a lot easier if you've taken a career break and you've gotten to do the stuff that you wanted to do. So when I was at my last job, I would get frustrated because it's like, oh, I got a week to do this, and I would try and knock one place out that I wanted to go, and I would arrive, it'd take me a day to get accustomed, I'd travel someplace else, and then I felt like I was coming home immediately. So, after taking my time off, having a couple weeks was kind of nice to go, this actually feels like a vacation. I'm not rushing to kind of knock off bucket list things, because I was able to do so many of them during my trip and do them kind of with, in a bit more of a relaxed environment.
It can be stifling. I could travel indefinitely, but I also do get a decent amount of vacation time. I have about 5 weeks, and I also have a boss, going back to what I said before about working for somebody who sees the importance in this, who, she's very flexible in allowing me to take additional time if I need it. I travel internationally about once a quarter right now. I just got back from Paris this past week, and I tacked on a couple of extra days, actually, and I didn't even have to ask permission for that because I can kind of work wherever I have a connection. So, it's all in how how you shape it yourself.
Nice. Questions? Yes.
Kind of goes along with the other one. Are any of you guys actively saving for a sequel trip?
Anyone saving for a sequel trip that's in a full-time job?
In the back of my mind, similar to where I was a couple of years ago, I think I've lived in New York almost my entire life. I'm ready to leave, and I think when I leave, whenever I transition, I might not just go straight from New York to the next place and to the next job. I might take another year off. But yeah, I think it'll be easier because I will be going to a new place. So it won't just be like, oh, you left another job for a year. It'll be like big shift, take a year off, and then start anew somewhere else.
I don't know necessarily about doing another trip, but I still in the back of my mind think about living or working overseas at some point. I think, if I was to do it again, I would, try to find a job overseas or, live somewhere, base myself somewhere, and then kind of travel from there, rather than doing the same kind of trip I did before. But it's still in the back of my mind. I'll probably stay where I am for a couple of years at least, but then, yeah, still kind of think about it every now and then.
Nothing. For me, I travel a lot still because I am flexible, but I don't think I would actually ever do the same 2.5 years or 4 years out of living out of a bag. I like kind of just going for a month or two now. Just kind of changes with life. Other questions? Career, returning to your, yep. Andrew. Any resources to help make phrasing on your resume and ideas of how to spin it on your resume?
I can't think of any resources in particular, but I'm happy to share my resume.
Yeah, I am too.
And show people the different versions of what I did and how I handled it.
And I would avoid spin because, I know from my time when I've had to hire people, and you get, especially students who did study abroad, and, and they go, oh, well, I was studying this, and I was studying this, and it's like, you were probably just partying in Scotland. I would be truthful and just, tell them what you did, and I wouldn't try to spin it and say, oh, I studied, or I worked, or I took, it gave me insight into something that it didn't. That's just my 2 cents.
Unless you did. You've taught
Yeah,
English,
if
you
you
taught
did it too.
English.
If you did it
You
too.
volunteered, and
Yeah.
maybe you traveled for a year, and you're saying some of the things you did doesn't mean you volunteered the whole year or taught English the whole year, but it's definitely something you did. And I think people can take the whole shebang into account, whether you were 21, just out of school, or if you're 35, doing your career break. Yes.
I just wanted to comment on maybe the two of you there is that I'm also in the financial background, but I like the idea of the functional resume, and that I don't want to work for the next employer who doesn't understand why I took it. I want to be in that interview who goes, wow, you took a year? God, that's great. What courage or whatever. That's what
It is a big kind of red flag if the employer's doesn't get it like some other people don't get it.
I've quit 2 jobs in my lifetime, and one.
It was more a statement. She was just kind of reiterating the fact that she doesn't want to work for an employer that doesn't get it. Now that you're moving on in your life, why put yourself back in that kind of place?
so I was saying I've quit another job in my life just because I burnt out and I didn't have another job lined up. And trust me, if you quit and say you have nothing, people get mad. And people, it's kind of like, what? You'd rather just not receive a paycheck than work here? And if you do something worthwhile, like I think this is, people understand it and they kind of go, okay, well, it took a really, really big kind of opportunity to make you leave. And it was a really big, decision on your part. People appreciate that.
Other questions? Last couple questions. Yep, back there.
Was there a reverse corporate culture shock? I left my job 14 months ago, and the idea of going back to a desk makes me shudder. And I rush for the door from the people. So what was it like to go back to that?
It's
Be honest.
why do I always get this question? It's not easy, but thankfully I assume you live in the area. I mean, there's a lot worse places to go home to than New York, where you have everything. But a desk is never going to be the same as when you're working from the beach or up in the mountains or things like that. But we do have to work sometimes in life. The best we can do is enjoy when you have the time and travel when you can. And
I think I'm fortunate in that I don't really have, I work for a university, so it's kind of more laid back in general, as compared to, when I was a lawyer and worked at a law firm or, working in a corporate environment. I think I'm lucky in that, I really enjoy my job. And, initially it was a bit getting used to, but I also, on the plus side, I really liked getting that paycheck again every 2 weeks, that I hadn't hit. Like that first paycheck I got when it showed up in my bank account, it was like, oh my God, I haven't gotten one of these for, almost 2 years. It was great. But, I liked getting back into the routine, but then I also took the time, I was back in Chicago and, spent more of my free time kind of playing tourist in my own town and finding other opportunities in Chicago to sort of keep that international connection going. One of the things I did, and I think there's similar organizations in a lot of cities, I got involved with a group in Chicago called World Chicago. It basically serves as the host in the city for international visitors, like through the State Department. And so they have all these opportunities for people to host international visitors, either as homestay hosts or just taking them out to dinner. And so that was something I got involved with that let me still have these international contacts even while I was in Chicago. So I kind of found ways like that to keep the trip sort of alive even while I was back working 9 to 5 again.
Last question.
You said that you were doing a lot of networking while you were on the road. Did you consider trying to have a job in another country?
The question is about considering having a job in another country and not coming back right away.
Not really, because I didn't fully detach from New York. I kept my apartment. I kept, a lot of open leads with jobs. So that wasn't kind of the end goal. My networking was mostly just so that when I came back, I could hit the ground running in regards to a job. But part of it went through my head of like, what if I could just get a job that I can work from the beach? But that's ultimately, I'm not the nomad like. Some people have more of that nomad gene. I'm definitely like, I want to be here, and then I want to be elsewhere, and then I want to be here, and I like having that home base. So yeah, I didn't so much think about it.
I did think about it, and I was open to it, and I didn't get a full-time job really anywhere. I found random stuff, but I was always left myself open to the possibility of working in another country, and I did end up working for a company in Spain, but I didn't have to be there, but they had me on contract for a year, which helped pay. All I thought about was that pays for my travels for another year because I kind of broke even again, and that was like my thinking. But my initial thought was to try to get a job abroad until that didn't happen, and then that's when I just traveled, and I said, I'm just doing this. But yeah, I think to me, just leaving yourself open, networking, which in a weird way, remember we learned about networking in school, but now to me it's just being. It's just you're always talking, meeting people, especially when you're traveling. So networking or whatever you want to call it, you're meeting people and finding a way to teach English or a real, a different kind of job. All right. Thank you guys so much. Thanks to the panel. Really appreciate it.